All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Silence of Savoir, a YouTube channel dedicated to the philosophy of Michel Foucault and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Today, we are not going to be talking specifically about these thinkers, but we might be bridging one way or another the analytic and continental divide. I have a very special guest today. His name is Adam Lovasz. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Adam Lovasz is a philosopher and researcher affiliated with Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. Adam's research interests center around post-humanism, post-anthropocentrism, process philosophy, object-oriented philosophy, nihilism, and more. Adam has written over 10 books. Most notably, most recently, he has written a book on H.P. Lovecraft. And in 2021, he has written an amazing book on Henri Bergson. I have written a review of this book, so I'm fairly familiar with the work. It's an amazing book. A little over my head, but it was it was a pleasure to read. Adam is presently working on a monograph entitled On Nature. He's also defending his dissertation. Adam has published over 60 papers in various peer-reviewed journals. Among these are American Studies, British Studies, Canadian Studies, the Chiasma Journal of Theory and Philosophy, Cosmos and History, Horizon Journal, Studies in Phenomenology, Horror Studies, Identities Journal for Politics, Gender and Culture, Iowa Journal of Cultural Studies, Open Philosophy, a journal called Rhizomes, and a journal called Textual Practice. I'm very happy to have you here, Adam. Thank you for agreeing to attend the interview. I'm going to pose three very open questions because I don't want to limit our discussion to anything. And then we'll see where that goes, right? So the first question is, what is process philosophy? Second question is, why did we decide to use Whitehead as a starting point? Because, as I know, there have been process philosophers before Whitehead, and there have been names that have been perhaps more often cited in the process philosophy literature than that of Whitehead. Often Whitehead is considered an analytic philosopher, right? So he is known as the tutor, the supervisor of Bertrand Russell, and he has made several developments in mathematics as well, if I'm not mistaken. And the final question would be, how does all of this tie into your current work titled On Nature? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very grateful that you invited me, and it's an honor to be able to chat with you about these topics, and also, yeah, like other topics which will connect to what we're talking about here. First of all, what process philosophy is. There's a lot of misconceptions around process philosophy. I think I think a major thing is that process philosophy thinks in terms of processes, in terms of time. But I would rather say that this is the most common idea, that it's about the way time works. It's about the impermanence of reality. But I would rather say that it's about change. We sometimes conflate these two and think that change is the same as time. It's very difficult to think in other terms. But I think this is more accurate to say that it's about the change being the substance of reality. Like in Bergson, for example, who's one of the great process philosophers who, as you mentioned, I wrote a book about in 2021, that Henri Bergson says that the substance of things is change. He doesn't say time, he says change. I think this is very significant, that there's no underlying substance beneath the changes apart from change itself. This is, I think, a revolutionary idea, and he was already working like in the late 19th century. Like his first books are like at the turn of the century, around about like Time and Free Will, that was published I think in 1896, if I remember correctly. Matter and Memory, that's like in the early 1900s. So he's a very early example of process philosophy. We could also mention Samuel Alexander, who was an Australian Jewish philosopher, and Henri Bergson was also of a Jewish nationality or Jewish descent, by the way. And so Samuel Alexander, again, he was already working in the 1910s. And Whitehead is a relatively late example. So he started doing because at first Whitehead was a mathematician. Basically, as a profession, he was a mathematician, and he only started doing philosophy seriously at the end of the 1910s, roundabout. So process philosophy, it's a way of taking change seriously, of conceptualizing change as the stuff of things. I think that would be like what is common to all of these thinkers. Now, I wouldn't conflate all of them. Bergson is very similar to Whitehead, but there are also important differences between them, between the way that they think about change. Like for Bergson, for example, Bergson is more talking about how we can't divide change into separate pieces. For Bergson, duration is like indivisible. We can't cut it up into slices. We do that in the natural sciences, like when I'm talking about like an organism, I'm separating it into the different organs, the different pieces. I'm talking about history, I'm dividing it into different eras, for example. So in science, we do this all the time. And Bergson doesn't say that this is not necessarily wrong. It just doesn't reflect reality as it is. So for Bergson, it's you can't really divide it. But Bergson does talk about different types of durations, like organic, like sort of spiritual, psychological, we could say, and also the inorganic. So even matter itself has a sort of duration. So it's not just about subjective time being the sole form of duration. Bergson does say that there are levels of duration. And this is often overlooked because a lot of researchers just read, oh, well, Bergson said that we can't divide duration. But there are still different levels of duration. Now, Whitehead is very different in this regard. He says that time is epochal. Epochal means that there are sort of like atoms of time, or it can be divided into moments. So the present for Whitehead is very much the center of attention. So Whitehead wasn't what we would call an actualist. But for Whitehead, everything is happening in the present. That's what matters. And for Bergson also is different because he talks more about memory, for example, like cosmic memory, the memory of the cosmos, and the past is also relevant for Bergson, even though I would say that also change is happening now, also for Bergson as well. But for Whitehead, it really is all about the present, the dynamic present. So, and also we can mention later examples as well, like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. That they are like later examples of process philosophy who were very much influenced by both Bergson and Whitehead. So they are like later examples. We can mention like Nicolas Rescher, for example. If I remember correctly, he's a living member of the process school. Rescher is sort of analytical again. So there are living examples. I would call myself also a process philosopher, but so there are, of course, many researchers today working in this tradition also. And this sort of brings me to your second question, like why Whitehead? Why Bergson? Why Whitehead? I am fundamentally interested in this school of thought as a whole. So both Bergson, the way I came to Bergson and Whitehead, it was through Deleuze and Guattari. I was interested in what influenced them. And this was my original motivation for getting to know these thinkers. But then I realized that they are even far more interesting than just footnotes to Deleuze and Guattari. They are strikingly original, creative thinkers in their own right, and they created entire metaphysical systems. And they created like a whole way of seeing the world as a dynamic self-actualization. This was really interesting for me because today I think much of philosophy has gotten less ambitious. Like most philosophers, I don't want to overgeneralize, but most philosophers today, they just work on small areas, specialties, like it's very specialized, like you have researchers who just write about Heidegger all the time, or just about Gadamer and hermeneutics and whatever, or Husserl or anything, and that's great, but I think if philosophy becomes over-specialized, it becomes unable to see like the big picture, and I think that's what makes these two thinkers in particular, and Samuel Alexander also. So this is what makes the process philosophers so interesting for me, is that they had this idea of philosophy as being about it has to give a picture of the world. It has to create a cosmology, like ontology. It's the most important thing, because that's what reality is. Like we have a philosophy has to say something about reality, and I think over the past half century, I think philosophy has sort of lost track of this, or I don't know how you see it, but this is like my view that philosophy has sort of lost the big picture, and these thinkers are ways of finding again this ambition to give a picture of the world, an image of the world. I think this is the goal of philosophy, and they were very, like Bergson and Whitehead. They were not just metaphysical. Like they write a lot about social issues as well. So they both of them had a social philosophy as well. That's extremely interesting for me. So that they really had something to say about everything, and in a very like Whitehead's Science and the Modern World. That's a book of social critique, basically. It's not just about ontology, so you can't really separate these things. The way you think about the world, it influences your social and political views. There's like a interchange. There's like a translation between these. So that's the reason why Whitehead is so appealing to me. He really does have like views which are relevant even today, and lots of warnings as well. Like he has many warnings for the future, especially in Science and the Modern World, which are highly relevant, I think, and we'll talk about these like later on, I think. And so I think this is one of the major things, and I think also the way that Whitehead goes beyond we can't put Whitehead and Bergson, also we can't put them in the analytical continental boxes. Like that's I think crucially important, that for me those thinkers are the most interesting. We can't categorize and just say, oh, this is just like fluffy continental philosophy. It doesn't have real world effects. I think these two thinkers in particular, we can't put them in boxes, and that's crucially important for me. So that's I think the two key motivations for why I am currently focused. I'm reading all of Whitehead's work. I'm like sort of halfway through, a little bit more than halfway, and I'm going to write also a book I think about Whitehead as well, specifically. But my project on nature, it's going to be hugely influenced by process and reality. So that book from Whitehead, and also his the concept of nature. So the way Whitehead thinks about nature is, I think, something we can learn from today by making philosophy more ambitious. And the Whitehead, he had the bravery, sort of the intellectual bravery, to talk about reality separately from the natural sciences. He doesn't say natural sciences are bad or they're wrong necessarily, but he says that there are things that only philosophy can do. And that's like very hugely missing, I think, in this age where the physicists get to say what black holes are and what reality is, what time is. You know, like I opened a book from Carlo Rovelli, who's an influential physicist, and I opened the book, and he starts the book with like, "Oh, philosophy doesn't have anything important to say about time." So I closed the book and I put it back. So I didn't read that book as a philosopher. Yes. So I think that sort of really like physics in particular does have a sort of monopoly today on like, if you as a philosopher come in and say, "Oh, you know, time isn't exactly this, or matter isn't this," the sort of physicists would say, "Oh, you're just a dilettante, you're just someone an amateur." Yeah, so that's what was really exciting for me in Whitehead, that he had the bravery to say, "No, you know, there's not everything which natural science can say. Philosophy can add something to the sciences." That's very important, I think. Yeah.
That's very nice. I was hoping to, I guess, just clarify a couple of things and do a little recap of what we've said, what you've said so far. One interesting thing you said, which I didn't sort of explicitly think about when I was going through some of the literature, it's that it's not about time, right? So I guess this is a post-Heideggerian thing to think that the notion of time, as opposed to the notion of space, is necessarily associated with change, right? That's not entirely so, but I guess a lot of people speak that way when they talk about process philosophy. So I guess we can say that the process philosophy is a very particular offers a very particular conception of time, which is not focused on spatializing time and presenting time as a series of discrete units, as physicists tend to do. So it offers an alternative view of time, which is maybe more similar to what art, literature, poetry has to offer. And this was another thing that, to me, as a Wittgenstein and a Foucault scholar, what grabbed my mind was Whitehead stating explicitly, I think, in Science in the Modern World, that poetry holds the key to reality, at least, if not more so, than science. Right? So it seems there is this important prosaic, literary, and poetic element to process philosophy which should not be neglected. And the second thing, which also reminded me of a lot of thinkers in phenomenology, like, for instance, Merleau-Ponty, was the idea of science being a derived language, right? So we usually think of science, and I think Einstein definitely thought of science as something that gets to the real essence of reality, whereas our experiential going about the world is a chimera. It's an illusion, right? And so, and I think Bergson also, he tried to reverse the order of things here and say, well, no, actually, science is a derived language. And so the primordial language is a type of embodied language of dynamic experiences that, as you said, cannot be put into these neat, segmented little boxes and classified in a way that's exhaustive. And so that brings us to the third question. That's a very big question and very interesting here, is the relationship between philosophy and science, right? So is philosophy supposed to be just a handmaiden, as they say, of science? Is the job of philosophers to just organize the concepts that physicists come up with and just help organize and classify the knowledge that science essentially gets at, right? So why can't philosophers be at the forefront of investigating the nature of reality? And then when you talked about the specialization in philosophy, I thought of that as like an alternative strategy to put philosophy on the sidelines, to get philosophy out of the main public discourse about on the nature of reality, right? Because if you say, oh, well, I'm just a Heidegger scholar, I don't have anything interesting to say about time in general, for instance, right? Like that would be a ridiculous statement, right? To say that you're a Heidegger scholar, but the physicists get to talk about time and you don't. And so it seems to be like an alternative strategy to get philosophy out of what is considered to be the business of science. Yes, I think these are the things I wanted to recap and elaborate on a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very glad you mentioned Merleau-Ponty, for example, because Merleau-Ponty, well, he was basically a member of the phenomenology school, but he does sort of had, in his late work, he did have this ambition of going beyond just the analysis of human experience. Like he was working on a sort of philosophy of nature. This is exemplified in his lecture course on nature, where he mentions Whitehead very much. Like Whitehead is a key inspiration for Merleau-Ponty, precisely because he was trying to sort of go in the direction of cosmology and ontology. Like for Merleau-Ponty, this scientism would be I guess the best expression for the idea that the natural sciences can show us reality as it is. This also applies a little bit to social sciences as well. So basically, I will call scientism the idea that science shows the truth, and it shows us what to do in every case. So it shows the truth, it reveals the truth, it unveils the truth. We could mention Heidegger here as well, who talks about this like Western model, I guess platonically inspired model that there's a reality out there which we unveil, and true knowledge is an unveiling of the reality as it is. So scientism is, I guess, the sort of secularized form of this idea that truth is unveiling. And Merleau-Ponty was like highly critical of this. It was very surprising actually for me how critical he is of this in the nature course. Like he is very critical of the idea that science can reveal what intelligence is, for example. Like he criticizes those kind of cybernetic thinkers who think that we can reveal the nature of the human mind, and we can even model it, and we can make machines from it, like artificial intelligence, like those kinds of research directions which went into artificial intelligence, what we would today call machine learning. Like Merleau-Ponty is highly critical of this. I was actually surprised that he even deals with these topics, but in hindsight, it's not that surprising, because Merleau-Ponty was very much he believed that that reductionism cannot exhaust reality and like the complex nature of experience. So I think Merleau-Ponty was highly influenced by Whitehead. The reason I find Whitehead's Science and the Modern World so inspiring is that it's basically a sort of methodical demolition of scientism. I think that would be the best word for what Whitehead is doing in Science and the Modern World. This demolishing the idea that modern sciences reveal everything and they reveal the nature of reality. He's very much against like empiricism, the idea that we can observe phenomena and that will explain what they are. And he's not anti-science, like neither Whitehead nor Merleau-Ponty, they were not against science. They weren't saying we should go back to a time before science, but they were very much against this epistemological monopolism, like the monopolization of legitimate, valid knowledge by the natural sciences. They were hugely opposed to that, and part of the reason for this monopoly is the very success of the natural sciences. Like Whitehead has a very, very interesting sentence in Science and the Modern World that man does not live by disinfectant alone. That's like a very, very, that was very, caught my eye because like they had like the Spanish flu epidemic, like in the pandemic in the after World War One. We've had the COVID pandemic right now, and that was like really grasped my attention. That Whitehead says man does not live by disinfectant alone. We need more values, more kinds of things. So humans can't live by just these. And it's very interesting that he chooses this disinfectant because it works. Like it does, it kills the bacteria, it kills the viruses. So it's a practical thing which you can't say it doesn't work. Science works. It hugely affects our world. We can do stuff. We can do a lot of things by applying science. So it's no surprise that the applied sciences are so influential because they work. They really do the things which they are meant to do. The problem is that they do a lot of other things as well, which we don't want them to do, like climate change.
Exactly.
Whitehead even mentions like environmental degradation, for example. That this wasn't a huge topic back then, but like he presented this. It's a lecture series in 1926, I think, Science and the Modern World. So it's based on a lecture he gave, and he talks a lot about towards the end of the book about the environmental damage, like the aesthetic damage that like industrial cities cause on Earth. So that it leads to a sort of a bad environment for people, and that's like the unintended effects. So the issue is that there's a lot of unintended effects of the application of science, because science it is responsible for like industry and the pollution and things like this, and and climate change it leads to more viruses as well. Overpopulation leads to like animal viruses going into humans. So it's a very complex issue, and so for Whitehead, his basic issue with the natural sciences, he says that natural science as it exists now, well, back in the 1920s, is that it's too deterministic, it's too atomistic. They think that we can sort of reduce reality to like natural laws, for example. We can say what causes what. So he was very against the sort of deterministic idea of science, and in many ways he was like a sort of a early example, I think, of that. There's many commentators who interpret Whitehead as a sort of early example of complexity theory. So basically, the idea that reality is way more complex and than what human knowledge is capable of revealing. So that there are limits to the potential for human knowledge to reveal reality, and also that natural laws are way more complicated than we would think. There's no one way determinism. For example, time isn't linear. It can go like backwards, forwards. So also that reality is sort of self-organizing. These are all insights which came like after Whitehead, but his philosophy contains these sorts of insights in an early form. And so that's why I think Whitehead is very relevant, like Science and the Modern World. And he does say that philosophy is like poetry, as you mentioned. I think that's like one of the first sentences in his book, that philosophy is closer to poetry in that it gives a sort of a frameless view of the world. It's like breaking down our cognitive frames, our solidified, fossilized ways of seeing the world, and reveal like a fluid
I'm
and
very sorry.
holistic
I have
view.
to interrupt you for a second. With the excuse of going on a break, I think my
Yeah,
Zoom's trial version is limiting my airtime, I guess, streaming time. So
yeah, yeah.
let's take a little break. I'll figure out a way around this issue, and we'll get back to because I want to delve deeper into Whitehead's cosmology.
Yes.
And maybe talk a little bit about Isabel Stengers as well, sort of the leading scholar in Whitehead studies, because she makes this connection between Whitehead and ecology much more explicit and relevant, right? So let's take a break and then come back with those topics.
Yeah, sure. Okay.